Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking what might be our most ambitious mission.
Feels like it.
A massive chronological journey through the entire history of the United States. We're talking colossal scope here. From the very first established societies right up to the political turmoil of, well, basically today.
Yeah.
And we're drawing from a really comprehensive documentary source that tries to wrap its arms around this incredible, sprawling story.
It's an immense source, definitely. And it asks this truly profound question, doesn't it? It posits the modern U.S. as having earned the title, the modern Roman Empire. Because of its scale, its ambition, its global dominance, not just military, but economic, cultural, too.
Yeah.
So our task, really, is to trace the violent, often contradictory, sometimes just astonishing roots of that dominance. We've got to understand the specific timeline, the events that led to the nation formally born on July 4th, 1776.
And to really get a handle on that ambition, we can't start in 1776, or even 1492 as the source here.
No, absolutely not.
We have to rewind way back, because long before any European explorer even, recorded the existence of this continent, it was home to complex, politically sophisticated societies.
Exactly. The source goes into quite a bit of detail on this. Hundreds of thousands of native peoples had developed systems of government, trade, even warfare. They governed specific regions for thousands of years before the 15th century even rolled around.
These were established, evolving civilization.
Totally. We have to just discard that old idea of an empty land simply waiting for visitors. It wasn't empty at all.
Okay, and speaking of those visitors, well, Columbus usually gets the credit, for opening the New World.
The big name, yeah.
He wasn't actually the first European. We need to talk about the long-forgotten Norse.
Yeah.
Why does the source even bring this up, this 500-year-old detour?
Well, it's a crucial analytical point, actually. The story starts around the year 1000. With the navigator Leif Erikson.
Right.
He heard about land west of Greenland from a guy named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who'd basically been blown off course accidentally.
Oh.
So Erikson deliberately sails across the Labrador Sea, finds this place, and eventually settles it.
And he sets up a small settlement, what we now know as L'Anse aux Meadows, or Meadows Cove, up in Labrador.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the key thing. The source points out that settlement, and maybe a few others nearby, they were abandoned after only about 20 years. The whole thing failed. It didn't stick.
Right. And that's the crucial part.
Does the source give a reason for why it completely fizzled out, making it just a historical footnote for almost 5 centuries?
It points to a couple of things.
Yeah.
Resource management was tough, obvious. But maybe most critically, they just failed to establish peaceful, sustainable relations with the indigenous populations they ran into. And unlike the later colonists, who had the backing of these massive, wealthy European empires.
Right. State-sponsored.
Exactly. The Norse just didn't have the resources or the manpower to keep an isolated outpost going so far from Greenland. That weakness meant the memory of North America basically faded in Europe. It allowed the whole narrative to kind of reset itself.
Which brings us then to 1492. Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, lands in the West Indies in October.
Mm-hmm.
He gets the credit for discovery in most history books, but what's really incredible is who got the naming rights for the entire hemisphere. That wasn't Columbus?
No, that distinction went to Amerigo Vespucci, Florentine explorer.
Okay.
And he played the geopolitical game brilliantly. He really popularized the idea that this wasn't just Asia, but a new world, a completely separate continent.
And he made maps.
He made maps, and critically, he sold them. Aggressively. Because he framed the knowledge, he distributed it, he got the ultimate distinction, having the entire hemisphere named after him, America.
Wow.
It's a real lesson in how, mapping and marketing can sometimes trump mere discovery in the history books.
That distinction, that naming must have really spurred the European competition then.
Oh, absolutely. By the early 16th century, you see this chaotic race. Spanish, English, French, Portuguese, Dutch, even the Swedish, all scrambling to map the North American East Coast.
A free-for-all.
Pretty much. And it led to some accidental duplication. John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, really. Sailing for England, he discovers Newfoundland in 1497.
Which is the same region the Vikings had settled centuries.
Exactly. But Cabot got the credit because at the time, nobody really knew about Ericsson's earlier expedition. It was lost to history, basically.
And meanwhile, the Spanish are pushing north from...
Yep. Explorers like Ponce de Leon, Cabeza de Vaca, de Soto, they're mapping Florida and the South. At the same time, the French, people like Cartier and Verrazzano, are exploring the St. Lawrence River and further down the East Coast.
So the continent is being carved up on paper based on who could draw the best map and plant a flag first.
That's a good way to put it. Claims based on lines on a map.
Now, regardless of who arrived first or, what their intentions were, trade, riches, mapping the source is crystal clear about the immediate toll of first contact on native population. Catastrophic.
absolutely devastating. There's no other word for it. The introduction of European diseases, smallpox and influenza were the big ones, just caused these waves of illness and deaths.
Because they had no immunity.
Exact. No acquired immunity. So you have entire villages just wiped out, sometimes even before colonists physically arrive to try and settle permanently. This biological toll wasn't just like a sad side effect.
No.
It critically weakened native society. It made the subsequent colonial conquest significantly easier than it might have been.
And the source really documents just how hard it was, even with that advantage, to establish a permanent foothold. You see failure after failure. The English attempts at Roanoke Island between 1585 and 1590. That's like the classic cautionary tale, right?
Roanoke, yeah. The lost colony. It really illustrates the brutal reality of early colonization, the first group there. Mostly military men.
Okay.
They immediately alienated the local Akaskogak village, burned it down after some minor disagreement, so their survival was miserable from the start.
Not a great start to relations.
Not at all. The second group, they were mostly middle-class London. Probably had no real wilderness skills.
Yeah.
And definitely not enough supplies.
So, disaster waiting to happen.
Pretty much. Relief missions failed to reach them in time. And in 1590, the settlements just found, abandoned, sacked maybe. The only clues left were CRO carved into a tree and Croatoan on a post.
Suggesting they might have gone to live with the Croatoan tribe.
That's the main theory. It's a real testament to how poor planning and, frankly, hostile relations just doomed a settlement.
Okay, so the English are struggling. But in contrast, Spanish, they proved their roots and their commitment to staying much earlier.
They did. There was actually a French Huguenot colony, French Protestants, who tried to settle near St. Augustine, Florida, back in 1564.
Right.
They were immediately attacked by rival Spanish force. All the male citizens were killed.
Wow.
And the subsequent settlement established there by the Spanish is rightly considered the first permanent European settlement in North America. They were playing a much longer, much more aggressive game from the outset.
Which sort of sets the stage, then, for the first lasting English success at Jamestown in 1607, founded by the London Company.
Mm-hmm. And their motivation was totally different from the Spanish religious zeal or the later Pilgrim. It was singular financial gain. Gold, riches, return on investment for the company. But they chose poorly. A marshy region of Virginia just rife with disease.
And the early suffering was immense, right? The famous starving
stag. Largely because the colonists were, well, gentlemen adventure, ill-suited for farming, focused on looking for gold that wasn't there instead of planting food.
So how did they survive at all?
It basically came down to dictatorial control. Captain John Smith's rigid reorganization, literally forcing people to work, establishing some kind of trade with the local Powhatan Confederacy, making them plant crop. That was the only way the colony endured those first few brutal years.
But just 12 years after its founding, Jamestown hits this really crucial dark mile, the introduction of enslaved people.
Yeah, this is a moment the source really zeroes in on, and we have to be clear about what it meant. 1619.
Okay.
20 to 30 enslaved Africans captured from a Spanish slave ship by English privateers, essentially pirates, licensed by the Crown. They arrive at Point Comfort, near Jamestown.
And this is the beginning.
This marks the beginning of chattel slavery in the future United States, a system where human beings are treated as personal property, bought, sold, inherited.
Just like livestock.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that the economic ambition of the colonies, especially in the South, became inextricably linked to this violent institution for the next 2.5 centuries. It's foundational in a terrible way.
And just 1 year later, 1620, we see a completely different motivation taking root up north, with the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Right, a total contrast. Instead of financial greed, the Puritans or separatists technically were seeking religious freedom. They wanted to practice their faith without interference from the Church of England. In
their unique situation, they actually landed outside the area their royal patent covered, didn't they?
They did, which led to this unique piece of political innovation, the Mayflower Compact.
Ah, yes.
They drafted it before they even got off the ship. Basically, an agreement to establish self-governance, majority rule, while still maintaining allegiance to the English crown.
So it set a precedent.
Absolutely. A precedent for communal, arguably democratic self-rule among colonists. Very different from the top-down, company-run hierarchy of Jamestown.
Their survival, though, like Jamestown's, was really dependent on cooperation with Native Americans, specifically the Wampanoag.
Highly dependent. And the key figure here is Squanto, or Tisquantuxet native with this just harrowing backstory.
He'd been kidnapped.
Kidnapped by an English captain, taken to Europe, learned English, somehow made his way back, only to find his entire village wiped out by disease. But he spoke English, so he worked as an interpreter and helped broker a crucial non-aggression agreement between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag sachem Massasoit.
And that relationship, built on mutual need, really, led to the famous First Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621.
Right. That 3-day celebration. It's a moment that, it gets heavily romanticized, obviously. Yeah. But it genuinely highlights the delicate balance of power in those very early years.
Mm-hmm.
Successful settlements absolutely relied on native aid, goodwill, and diplomacy.
A balance, though, that the source suggests was already starting to fade rapidly.
Very rapid.
Okay, so throughout the rest of the 17th century, the English settlements, they grow, they consolidate. Plymouth gets absorbed by the bigger Massachusetts Bay colony. Trade starts to flourish.
Mm-hmm.
But this wasn't just an English story. The other European powers are still very much in the game, carving out huge spheres of influence.
Oh, definitely. And the Dutch story is a perfect example of how quickly imperial power could shift hands back then.
New Amsterdam.
Exactly. In 1614, the Dutch West India Company establishes New Netherlands. They're focused mainly on the fur trade, which was incredibly lucrative.
Right.
Their main hub is New Amsterdam, founded after the famously purchased Manhattan Island from the Munsee Lenape tribe in 1624 for, the legendary $24 worth of goods.
Always hear that number, so it becomes a major trading post.
Immediately, a huge commercial magnet. And that success made it an irresistible target for the English.
Who were right next door.
Right. So in 1664, the English just show up. 4 frigates sail into the harbor, demand surrender. And the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, he basically has no choice.
They just gave it up.
Complied bloodlessly. And the English promptly rename it New York City.
And the strategic game for England there must have been enormous.
Huge. They now controlled a continuous stretch of coast, effectively cutting off the French further north from the southern colonies and solidifying their access to the interior via the Hudson River. It was a major power play.
Okay, so the Dutch are pushed out of that key spot, but the French and Spanish empires, they're operating on a much grander scale geographically, aren't they?
Far grander than the small clustered English colonies at this. Spain's influence stretched north and east from St. Augustine in Florida, traveling inward towards their vast conquests in Mexico. They claimed huge swaths of the deep south, the Midwest, and the West.
And the French?
The French were focused on the St. Lawrence River Valley, Quebec, Montreal, dominating the fur trade there. And they were constantly pushing south, looking for a route to the Pacific, extending their influence down the Mississippi River.
Which eventually leads them to Louisiana.
Exactly. They established New Orleans, in 1718. They basically claimed the entire massive heartland of the continent.
So you have these overlapping massive imperial claims, but the relentless expansion of the English settlements pushing inland from the coast, that's what started really ignoring the complex political realities of...
Yes, and that inevitably led to massive bloody conflict. The most significant one in this period is King Philip's War,
which erupts in New England in 1675. What were the root causes?
The source points to the usual tragic suspect: colonial land intrusion onto native hunting and farming grounds, disputes over livestock colonists, pigs and cattle destroying native cornfields, and increasingly aggressive efforts by colonial missionaries trying to convert natives to Christianity, which was seen as an attack on their culture and sovereignty.
And King Philip. He was the son of Massasoit, the chief who'd helped the Pilgrims.
He was. Metacomet, that was his Wampanoag name, saw the existential threat posed by the relentless colonial expansion. Diplomacy failed. So war broke out between the colonists and the Wampanoag Confederacy, which Metacomet led.
And the colonial response.
Brutal. Organized. The New England militia specifically targeted native villages, burning homes, destroying food stores. It was a total war approach. The conflict ended with Metacomet's death in 1676. The result was the near total destruction of the Wampanoag and their allies, southern New England. This wasn't just a battle. The source calls it the bloodiest conflict, proportionally, in North American history.
Wow. Proportional to the population at the time?
Exactly. It showed the devastating cost of colonization resistance.
And that regional conflict then quickly merges into these larger European imperial proxy wars, right?
Yeah, the colonists are essentially fighting battles for their mother countries, often alongside native allies who are also playing the imperial game. King William's War from 1689 to 1697.
First of the big four.
Right. It pitted English-backed Iroquois against French-backed Wabanaki Confederacy tribe. Neither side really achieved its main goals, capturing Boston or Quebec, so it ended mostly in a stalemate.
But the pattern continues with Queen Anne's War. That's the War of Spanish Succession in Europe, starting around 1701.
Correct. It originates in Europe over who gets the Spanish throne, but its impact in America was profound.
How so?
It further decimated native populations caught in the middle, and it resulted in significant territorial gains for the English securing control over Georgia and grabbing Acadia, which becomes Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland from the French.
So England is consolidating.
Definitely. And the source emphasizes this point. After about 3 decades of relative peace following Queen Anne's War, the colonies really started to mature. They developed complex colonial governments, vibrant economies, and crucially started to see themselves less as just outposts of England and more as, well, something distinct, something American, perhaps.
Sense of identity is starting to form.
Slowly, but yes.
And that period of peace, those 3 decades, it really fueled an explosion in the North America, didn't it? Agriculture, textiles, maritime trade, things are booming.
They really are. But we have to analyze the foundation of that boom. The source is very clear. The structural reality was the triangle.
Right, the transatlantic slave trade.
And specifically how the demand for sugar and molasses, grown by enslaved labor in the Caribbean, fueled this grotesque global system of selling human lives.
And the scale just exploded.
The numbers are staggering. Early on, say 1600 to 1625, maybe 300,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas.
Okay.
By the mid-18th century, 1751 to 1775, that figure skyrockets to over 2 million.
2 million people in just 25 years.
In that period alone, yeah. This immense, rapid increase in chattel slavery was the absolute engine of colonial wealth, particularly in the South, but benefiting the North through trade and shipping, too. It's impossible to overstate its importance to the colonial economy.
And while this economic horror is defining the landscape, the spiritual landscape is undergoing its own revolution.
Yeah, a massive global evangelical revival. And it was really foundational for the colonists' sense of identity, their sense of individual worth.
How did that work? It was led by these traveling preachers, right?
Itinerant preachers, exactly.
Yeah.
Spreading new dogma that emphasized personal salvation, individual rebirth, a direct relationship with God, bypassing the established church hierarchy.
So how does that religious fervor translate into, the political stuff leading up?
It's a subtle connection, but the source argues it's critical. This intense focus on the individual's direct, unmediated relationship with God fostered a profound sense of individualism. And with that came a skepticism towards centralized hierarchical authority, whether that was a bishop or eventually a distant king in parliament. It nurtured a sense of self-determination.
And the scale of this movement was huge. You mentioned George Whitefield preaching in Boston in 1740.
The illustrative fact the source uses is credible. Whitefield allegedly drew a crowd of over 30,000 people.
In a city of what, 17,000?
Exactly. Nearly double the city's population came out to hear. It just shows the magnetic power of this shared, powerful, individual spiritual experience. It was unifying people across regional lines in a new way, right before they needed to unite politically.
Fascinating. But that unity was always being threatened by the constant imperial squabbles between Britain, France, and Spain.
Always. Distrust over trade, especially in the South American market, led to the wonderfully named War of Jenkinses starting in 1739.
Okay, I have to stop you there. The source mentions this, and it's just so absurd. This whole war was sparked because a Captain Robert Jenkins shows up in Parliament,
waving his severed ear, supposedly.
Claiming Spanish officials cut it off while searching his ship for contraband sugar off Cuba. How does one ear start a war?
Well, it wasn't really about the ear itself. It was the political opportunity. Jenkins' story, true or embellished, provided the perfect, visceral propaganda moment. It justified British aggression against Spain to protect trade rights they felt were being violated.
A convenient
Pretty much. And that conflict then quickly merges into the larger King George's War in 1742. That's the War of Austrian Succession in Europe.
Right. And the colonists actually score a major victory in this one.
They do. Colonial forces captured the strategically vital French fortress Louisbourg, right at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. A huge morale boost.
Yet then the treaty ends the war in 1748.
And everything goes back to the pre-war boundaries. The colonists are forced to hand Louisbourg back to the French.
It must have been furious.
Absolutely infuriated. They fought and died for territory they weren't allowed to keep. That simmering resentment, combined with ongoing disputes, finally boils over into the big one, the French and Indian, or as the Europeans called it, the 7 Years' War, starting in 1754.
And the flashpoint this time is the Ohio River Valley.
Critical territory, claimed by both the British, specifically Virginia, and the French. The lieutenant governor of Virginia sends a young militia major, George Washington, out there twice to tell the French to leave.
Doesn't work.
Not surprising. Things escalate catastrophically after Washington's native allies kill a wounded French commander during a skirmish. Washington hastily builds Fort Necessity,
which gets immediately surrounded by the French.
And he's forced to surrender. The sources are clear. This seemingly small frontier conflict ignites the largest European land war to date. Right. And because France gets bogged down fighting Prussia and others in Europe, they have to divert resources away from North America. This allows the British, with their naval superiority, to really dominate here.
They blockade the St. Lawrence,
which cuts off supplies to the French fort, leads directly to the capture of Quebec in 1759, a decisive battle, and then Montreal in 1760.
basically ending French power in North America.
Effectively, yes. The war officially concludes with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Britain definitively cements its control, eliminating France as a continental rival. But the cost?
Astronomical.
1.4 million casualties globally. And Britain ran up a massive war debt. The source emphasizes this is the critical turning point. Britain's attempt to make the American colonists pay a share of that debt for a war fought largely for imperial gain was the fundamental error that led directly to the revolution.
Okay, so 1763. Victory. Britain gets Canada, all the French territory east of the Mississippi. The colonists naturally think, great, westward expansion time.
Yeah, they felt they'd earned that land. Many had fought for it.
But King George III immediately slams the door shut. The Royal Proclamation of 1760.
Right. Forbidden settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, the proclamation line. The stated reason was to prevent costly conflicts with native tribes who live there.
But the colonial perspective.
Betrayal, pure and simple. It fundamentally undercut their whole reason for fighting the war, in their eyes. This immediately ramps up tension with British authorities trying to enforce this line that colonists routinely ignored.
And on top of that territorial frustration comes the economic paying off that huge war debt.
Exactly. Britain starts levying acts and taxes. Now, the source points out the issue for the colonists wasn't necessarily the amount. The taxes were actually quite low compared to taxes in Britain itself.
It was the principle.
It was the principle, the lack of consultation. No taxation without representation becomes the rallying cry. They truly believed they held all the rights of natural-born British subjects, including the right to be taxed only by their own elected representative.
Which they didn't have in Parliament.
Precisely. So we see this progression of legislation designed to extract revenue. First, the Sugar Act in 1764, regulating import, favoring the British East India Company, the EIC, this massive, dominant, almost governmental trading monopoly.
Colonists protested that, right? Boycotts.
They did, though interestingly, the EIC still had one of its best years in 1774 despite them. But the real shift, the one that sparks organized resistance, is the Stamp Act in 1760.
Because it was different.
It was the first direct tax levied specifically on the colonists for internal goods and services. Newspapers, legal documents, licenses, even playing cards had to have a stamp showing the tax.
That directness really hit home.
It did. And it sparked the creation of secret organizations like the Sons of Liberty, who weren't afraid to use intimidation and violence.
The source mentions them ransacking Chief Justice Thomas Hutt's home.
Yeah, a shocking act. Forced him and his family to flee for their lives. Shows the level of anger.
But there was also a more formal political response.
Yes. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress in New York. They compiled a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, arguing the tax violated their rights as Englishmen.
And it worked.
Temporarily.
Yeah.
Benjamin Franklin argued persuasively in London. Boycotts were hurting British merchants. So Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, a major colonial victory. But simultaneously, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which basically asserted their right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So they took away the specific tax but doubled down on the claim.
Exactly. The fundamental conflict over who had the ultimate power remained unresolved.
Yeah.
And it flares right back up with the Townsend Acts in 1767.
What did those do?
Taxed essential imported goods. Lead, glass, paper, paint, and significantly tea. It also created a new customs board in Boston to enforce collection, suspended the New York Assembly for not complying with an earlier quartering act.
Forcing colonists to house British soldiers.
Right. And crucially, it granted admiralty courts, military courts, basically jurisdiction over customs violations. This stripped authority from local colonial courts where smugglers often got sympathetic juries.
How did this feel to the average colon? Can you synthesize that?
It felt like a constant squeeze, both financially higher prices and legally. Having trade disputes judged by British naval officers, not your peers, felt like a fundamental violation of their rights as British citizens. The resentment just built and built.
To the point where British troops had to be sent to occupy Boston.
Yes, which directly sets the stage for the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770.
And that started small, didn't it? An argument between a sentry and an apprentice.
Yeah, a snowball fight. Insults traded. A crowd gathers, maybe 300, 400 people. They start throwing ice, oyster shells, yelling, "Fire, damn you, fire," at the soldiers.
Tensions are sky high.
A private gets hit with something, maybe slips. His musket goes off accidentally. That seems to trigger a ragged volley from some of the other soldiers.
And people were killed.
5 colonists died, including Crispus Attucks, former slave of mixed African and Native American descent, became an instant martyr figure.
The trial afterwards was a huge deal. John Adams defending the soldiers.
Which was remarkable. Adams, a patriot leader, believed fiercely in the right to a fair trial for everyone. He actually secured the acquittal of 6 soldiers. 2 were convicted of manslaughter. It showed a commitment to legal principle, even amidst intense political fury.
Okay, so things cool down slightly after the massacre. Some taxes are repealed, except the one on, which leads to the next big flashpoint, the Boston Tea Party in 1770.
Right. The Tea Act wasn't actually a new tax. It was designed to bail out the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly in the colonies, duty-free in England, but still subject to the Townsend duty in America. This undercut colonial merchants and smugglers.
So the Sons of Liberty saw it as Parliament asserting its right to tax them, using the EIC as the vehicle.
Exactly, and as a move towards monopoly. So they dressed as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor, and dumped 342 crates of tea overboard.
A huge amount.
Massive financial loss for the EIC. About 9,659 portas sterling, which the source calculates is equivalent to maybe $1.7 million today. A dramatic act of defiance.
And Parliament's reaction this time was not understanding.
Not understanding is putting it mildly. Outrage. This led directly to the Coercive Act, or what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts of 1774.
Designed specifically to punish Massachusetts.
Severely. The Boston Port Act closed the port until the tea was paid for, crippling the city's economy. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's charter, restricted town meetings, put it under direct British control.
What else?
The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain, not Massachusetts. Colonists called it the Murder Act. And a new, stronger quartering act was applied to all colonies, allowing governors to seize buildings to house troops.
But punishing Massachusetts so harshly, did it work? Did it isolate?
Exactly the opposite. It united the other colonies in sympathy and outrage. They saw it as, if Parliament can do this to Massachusetts, they can do it to us next.
Which leads to the First Continental Congress.
Yep. In Philadelphia, 1774, they petitioned King George III to repeal the acts. They get no reply. So the Second Continental Congress convenes in May 1775, basically preparing for the inevitable war.
And the inevitable arrives quick. April 19, 1775. Lexington and Concord.
The shot heard around the world. The Sons of Liberty discover British General Gage plans to seize a cache of militia weapons stored in Concord. Paul Revere and William Dawes ride out to warn the countryside.
And the militia gathers on Lexington Green.
British regulars arrive, ordered the militiamen to disperse and disarm. They refuse. Tensions ratchet up, and then a single shot rings out. Nobody knows who fired first.
But it starts the fighting.
It starts the war. And the source is really specific here. At this point, this is not a revolution for independence. It's seen by most colonists as a rebellion, an armed conflict, to reclaim what they saw as their natural-born rights as British subjects, which Parliament had violated.
Independence comes later. First, they need an army.
Right. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, a very costly victory for the British Congress realizes they need unity, a unified command structure, a continental army.
And they choose George Washington as commander-in-chief.
Unanimously. His experience from the French and Indian War, though, frankly, his battlefield record wasn't stellar.
No.
It was still significant. More importantly, perhaps, he was a Virginian. His selection was a crucial political move to appease the Southern delegates, ensuring broader geographical buy-in for the cause.
But leading this new army, it wasn't easy. The internal friction was immediate and intense.
Oh, profound. The Army constantly struggled. Lack of supplies, lack of training, huge differences in command styles between officers from different colonies, and intense disunity among the troops themselves.
The source has that amazing detail about Washington having to physically break up a brawl.
Between Massachusetts and Virginia soldiers, he literally had to ride in and separate them. It just perfectly humanizes the struggle. The very force created to unify the colonies could barely stand each other.
It really highlights that core conflict of the whole American experiment, doesn't it? Trying to forge cohesion out of these profoundly different regional identities.
Absolutely. It's there from day one. Despite all these issues, Washington, with artillery, ingeniously hauled overland from Fort Ticonderoga by Colonel Henry Knox.
An incredible feat in winter.
Manages to besiege Boston, placing cannons on Dorchester Heights overlooking the city. This forces the British fleet and army to evacuate Boston in March 1776. A huge early victory for morale.
Meanwhile, the political situation is hardening. The Olive Branch Petition, Congress's last attempt at reconciliation.
Rejected outright by the king, Congress is declared a pack of traitors. At that point, the push for actual sovereignty for independence becomes pretty much unavoidable for many delegates.
And that summer, 1776, the faction led by people like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they realize something.
They understand that to actually win the war, they need foreign help, specifically from France.
Britain's main rival.
Exactly. And France would only ally itself with and provide aid to a sovereign, independent nation, not just a bunch of rebels.
So the Declaration of Independence isn't just a philosophical statement, it's a strategic necessity.
It serves both purposes, absolutely. Drafted largely by Thomas Jefferson, representing Virginia. Famously, a section condemning the British slave trade was removed to appease Southern delegates.
Another early compromise with lasting consequences.
Indeed. It's adopted by Congress on July 2nd, formally ratified and announced on July 4th, 1776, declaring those now famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
A radical statement for its time, but the immediate British military response, swift and brutal.
Devastating. Washington suffers a string of defeats, loses New York City, is forced to retreat across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania by late 1770.
This is the really dark hour for the revolution, isn't it? The army's ragged, morale is plummeting.
On the brink of collapse. It was saved, the source argued, by two acts of sheer audacity by Washington.
Trenton and Princeton.
Crossing the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, to surprise and capture the Hessian garrison at Trenton, his first real battlefield victory. And then, 9 days later, another clever maneuver leads to a win at Princeton.
Were these strategically decisive?
Not really in the grand scheme, but they were massive psychological victories. They boosted morale, encouraged re-enlistment, and basically kept the flickering hope of the revolution alive through a brutal winter.
Okay, so the flame doesn't go out, but the real military turning point comes later, right?
Saratoga, New York, 1777. British General John Burgoyne, leading an army down from Canada, gets bogged down, outmaneuvered, and is ultimately surrounded and forced to surrender his entire force, nearly 7,000 men.
A huge blow to the British.
And critically, this decisive victory is what finally convinces the French government that the United States might actually win.
So they come in.
They sign a formal military alliance in 1778, declare war on Great Britain. This legitimizes the Declaration of Independence on the world stage and provides absolutely vital naval support, troops, and money. It transforms the conflict.
So with French help and crucial training provided by foreign volunteer officers like the Marquis de Lafayette from France and Baron von Steuben from Prussia,
who literally wrote the Army's drill manual and whipped the Continental troops into something resembling a professional European fighting force,
Washington manages to refine his army. The war then shifts focus, moving south.
Yes, the British adopt a southern strategy, hoping to rally loyalist support there. They capture Savannah and Charleston, but the American commander in the south, General Nathaniel Greene, plays a brilliant campaign of attrition.
How so?
He avoids major battles he can't win, lures the main British army under Lord Cornwallis deep into the Carolina backcountry, stretching their supply lines. This leads to decisive patriot victories by militia and Greene's regulars at places like Kings Mountain and Cowpens,
forcing Cornwallis to regroup.
Cornwallis marches his weary army north into Virginia, eventually fortifying a position at Yorktown on the coast, hoping for resupply or evacuation by the British Navy.
Which turns out to be a fatal mistake.
Because the French Navy, thanks to the alliance, manages to gain temporary control of the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any escape by sea. Washington, coordinating with the French army under Rochambeau, marches south rapidly, surrounds Yorktown on land.
Trapped.
Completely trapped. Cornwallis is forced to surrender his entire army in October 1781. While fighting continued elsewhere, Yorktown effectively ends the war.
And the
Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, Great Britain formally recognizes the United States of America as a free, sovereign, and independent nation. The war was...
Okay, independence, but winning the war was one thing. Governing the new nation was a whole different challenge.
Immediately apparent. First attempt at a national government, the Articles of Confederation, adopted back in 1777. It just wasn't up to the job.
What was the fundamental flaw of the source point?
Weakness. It created a very weak central government, basically just a league of friendship between the states. The National Congress had very limited power.
Like, what couldn't it do?
Crucially, it couldn't levy taxes directly. It had to request funds from the states, who often didn't pay up. It couldn't regulate interstate or international trade effectively. It had no power to mediate disputes between states over things like boundaries or tariff. It was designed to prevent tyranny, but it created chaos instead.
And this weakness becomes really undeniable. Shays' Rebellion.
Right. In western Massachusetts, unpaid Revolutionary War veterans, farmers facing foreclosure because they couldn't pay debts and taxes in hard currency, they rise up. Led by Daniel Shays, they shut down courts to prevent foreclosures.
And the national government couldn't stop it.
had no power, no money, no standing army to intervene in effect. Massachusetts had to raise its own militia to put down the rebellion. This event terrified the property classes across the country. It demonstrated the federal government's utter inability to maintain domestic order.
An international.
Similar problem. The central government lacked the authority to enforce parts of the Treaty of Paris, like compelling states to repay debts to British merchants or return confiscated loyalist property. As a result, British troops were still occupying forts on U.S. territory in the Northwest, a clear sign of American impotence on the world stage.
So the articles are clearly failing. There's an urgency.
A real sense of crisis. This leads directly to the call for a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles.
But they quickly realized that wasn't enough.
It became clear almost immediately that the Articles were irreparable. They needed a whole new design for government.
And the result is the Constitution, a system of checks and balances. 3 distinct branches.
Legislative Congress, Executive President, Judicial Supreme Court. A brilliant, intricate design intended to balance power and prevent any one branch from becoming too dominant.
The biggest fight was over representation in Congress, right?
Yeah.
Big states versus small states.
The Great Compromise, yes, solved by creating a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives with representation based on state population, satisfying the large states, and the Senate with 2 representatives per state, regardless of size, satisfying the small states.
And the judiciary, the Supreme Court.
Established by the Constitution, but its most crucial power, judicial review, the ability to declare laws unconstitutional wasn't explicitly stated. That would be firmly established later in the landmark case, Marbury v. Madison in 1803.
What the source really highlights, though, is the concept of sovereignty in the Constitution.
Yes, starting with those 3 powerful words, we the people. This was revolutionary. It was the first time a nation's foundational document explicitly declared that the government's legitimacy derived directly from the people, not from a monarch or even from the states themselves.
But getting it ratified wasn't easy. Big debate.
Fierce debate. Split between the Federalists, people like Hamilton, Madison, James Shea, who wrote the brilliant Federalist Papers arguing for the Constitution and a strong central government.
And the anti-Federalists,
who feared the new government would be too powerful, trample on states' rights, and potentially become tyrannical, just like the British monarchy they had overthrown. They demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties.
Which they eventually got.
Yes, the promise of adding a Bill of Rights was crucial for securing ratification. New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify in 78, making the Constitution the official framework of the U.S. government.
Which brings us to the first president, George Washington, elected unanimously in 17.
A testament to his stature. He favored Federalist policy, aiming to strengthen the new national government and establish its authority, and he set crucial precedents.
Like dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion.
Right, in 1790. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were protesting a federal tax on whiskey, which was often used as currency on the frontier. They attacked tax collectors. Washington saw this as a direct challenge to federal authority.
And he responded forcefully.
He personally led federal troops into the region to put down the rebellion, a very literal interpretation of his role as commander-in-chief, sending a clear message that the national government would enforce its law.
Foreign policy was tricky, too, dealing with the French Revolution, conflicts with Britain.
Very tricky. Jay's treaty with England was particularly controversial, angering pro-French faction. Washington famously warned against the dangers of permanent foreign alliances and the formation of political parties in his farewell address.
But his most crucial
stepping down after 2 terms, voluntarily relinquishing power. This established the norm and prevented the expectation of a president for life or a dynastic succession. Hugely important for the Republic.
His successor, John Adams, a Federalist, inherited those foreign struggles, the unofficial quasi-war with France.
And Adams pushed through the very unpopular Alien and Sedition Act, which allowed the government to deport foreigners deemed dangerous and arrest citizens who criticized the government, seen by many as a violation of free speech.
Then the election of 1800 brings a shift.
A big shift. Thomas Jefferson, leader of the Democratic Republicans, the precursors to today's Democrats, defeats Adams. Jefferson worked to undo some Federalist policies, cutting the national debt, reducing the Army and Navy, repealing the whiskey tax. He also dealt decisively with the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean.
But his defining legacy is arguably the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Absolutely transformed. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing funds for his wars in Europe and having lost interest in a French empire in North America after the Haitian Revolution, offers to sell the vast Louisiana territory to the U.S.
for a bargain price.
Pennies per acre. It instantly doubled the size of the United States, opening up a massive new frontier for westward expansion.
Fulfilling that continental ambition almost overnight.
And Jefferson immediately acted to solidify the claim. He commissioned the Corps of Discovery.
Lewis and Clark.
Sent them out to map the new territory, find a water route to the Pacific, establish trade relations with native tribes, and assert American presence before Britain or Spain could effectively challenge the purchase.
A journey made possible in large part by their Shoshone guide.
Sacagawea. Her knowledge of the terrain and languages was invaluable. They made contact with over 70 tribes, produced 140 maps, an incredible expedition that really opened the West to American eyes.
Okay, so the U.S. has doubled in size, but this rapid expansion brings new challenge. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, inherits rising tensions with Britain and France.
Still seizing American ships, interfering with trade, and the British practice of impressment, basically kidnapping American sailors off U.S. ships and forcing them into the Royal Navy, was a major point of outrage.
And there were voices in Congress pushing for war.
The war hawks, yeah. Younger politicians like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, mostly from the South and West, were demanding militant action to defend American honor and assert national sovereignty. Madison eventually gave in and declared war on Britain in June 1812.
The War of 1812, was the U.S. ready?
Not really. The military was small, poorly equipped, and unprepared. Early attempts to invade Canada were disastrous failures, though American forces did manage to burn the city of York, modern-day Toronto.
And Native Americans got drawn in again.
Crucially, yeah. Many tribes, led by the charismatic Shawnee chief Tecumseh, allied with the British. They saw this as perhaps their last best chance to halt relentless American expansion westward by creating an independent native state.
But Tecumseh's death
At the Battle of the Thames in 1813 was a devastating blow. It effectively fractured the Native Confederacy and ended that dream of unified resistance east of the Mississippi.
The war had its low points for the U.S., right? Washington, D.C. burned.
The absolute nadir. In August 1814, British forces captured Washington and burned the Capitol building and the White House. First Lady Dolly Madison famously ensured the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington was saved before fleeing.
But the U.S. had some key successes. Fort McHenry.
The successful defense of Fort McHenry during the British bombardment of Baltimore inspired Francis Scott Key to write the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner.
And the Battle of New Orleans.
A famous, lopsided American victory led by Andrew Jackson in January 1815. Ironically, it was fought after the peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, had already been signed in Europe, but news hadn't crossed the Atlantic yet.
So what was the key legacy of the War of 1812, according to...
Two main things. First, it definitively ended any realistic hope for Native Americans east of the Mississippi to establish sovereignty over their ancestral land through alliance with European power. Second, it sent a clear message to Europe. The United States, despite its internal divisions and military struggles, was here to stay. It solidified American independence and legitimacy on the world stage.
With that legitimacy secured, the ideology of manifest destiny really takes hold.
Right. This belief, almost religious for some, that the United States was unquestionably destined, by God or by history, to expand across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Sea to Shining Sea.
And this was asserted globally through the Monroe Doctrine back in 1820.
Yeah, President Monroe warning European powers that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization, basically declaring it the U.S. sphere of influence.
But manifest destiny in practice was often a justification for, well, conquest and removal.
Absolutely. And the source points directly to President Andrew Jackson, fervent believer in westward expansion. He made earlier plans for assimilation or relocation of native tribes a brutal reality with the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Forcing the 5 civilized tribes out of the Southeast.
The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, around 60,000 people forced to abandon their homes, their farms, their established societies in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida.
And the journey west, the Trail of Tears.
A forced march under horrific conditions, disease, starvation, exposure. The source estimates around 15,000 Native people died during the relocation. It's the stark human cost of manifest destiny.
Meanwhile, white pioneers are pushing west too, risking everything on trails like the Oregon Trail.
A grueling 2,000-mile journey from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City. The hardships were immense. Disease was the biggest killer, but also accidents, weather, occasional skirmishes.
The Donner Party story is probably the most infamous example of the heart.
1846-47 became snowbound high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, resorted to cannibalism to survive, a horrifying symbol of the risks.
And then gold is discovered in California in 1840.
Right as California is being acquired from Mexico, actually. This triggers the massive gold rush. San Francisco's population explodes almost overnight. Prospectors, the 49ers, pour in.
But the source notes something interesting about the gold.
Yeah, that for many people, it was actually far more profitable to sell goods and services to the miners, food, supplies, tools, lodging, entertainment, than it was to actually pan for gold itself. Fortunes were made provisioning.
And the need for faster communication between California and the East leads to the Pony Express.
Briefly, yes. Operated for only about 18 months, 1861. A relay system of riders carrying mail across the plains and mountains in about 10 days. Vital for its time, but quickly made obsolete by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph line in 1861.
Now, westward expansion also leads directly to conflict with Mexico, starting with Texas.
Right. Texas was part of Mexico after Mexican independence from Spain. Mexico encouraged Anglo-American settlement there, but the settlers brought slaves with them, which Mexico had abolished in 1829. This, plus political issues, led to tension.
And the Anglo-Texans revolt against the Mexican dictator Santa Anna.
Revolt begins in 1835. The most famous battle is the Siege of the Alamo Mission in San Antonio in 1836. Fewer than 300 Texan defenders, including figures like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, hold out for 13 days against Santa Anna's army before being overwhelmed and massacred.
Remember, the Alamo becomes the rallying cry.
Fuels the revolution. Texas wins its independence shortly after, becomes an independent republic for about a decade, and is then annexed by the United States in 1845.
And that annexation leads directly to the Mexican-American War.
Immediately fought from 1846 to 1848, primarily over disputed border territory between Texas and Mexico. The U.S. military, with more modern weaponry and organization, relatively easily defeats the Mexican forces.
And the result is a massive land grab.
Huge. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico cedes vast territories that make up nearly the entire American Southwest. California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Manifest destiny is largely achieved geographically.
But every square mile of new territory intensifies the biggest underlying conflict in the nation: slavery.
Absolutely. The crucial question becomes, will these new territories be open to slavery or will they be free? This threatens the fragile balance of power between slave states and free states in Congress, particularly in the Senate.
And the previous attempts to manage this conflict, the Compromise.
They were basically temporary fixes. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state, but Maine as free, and drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase territory. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, but included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, requiring Northerners to return escaped slaves.
These just delayed the inevitable, didn't they?
Kicked the can down the road.
Yeah.
The source argues the final legislative failure was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It introduced the idea of popular sovereignty.
Letting the settlers in the territory decide for themselves whether to allow slavery.
Exactly. Sounds democratic, but the result in Kansas was chaos and violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed in, clashed violently, hundreds were killed. It was literally a regional civil war, bleeding Kansas.
Showing that political compromise was breaking down.
Completely. And the ultimate sign that violence was becoming the only path, at least for extremists, was John Brown's raid in 1859.
The radical abolitionist.
Brown attempted to incite a massive slave rebellion by seizing the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now Westward. His hope was to arm slaves and start a guerrilla war.
But it failed quickly.
Swiftly defeated by U.S. Army forces under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and executed. But he became a martyr figure for the abolitionist cause in the North and a terrifying symbol of Northern aggression to the South. It polarized the nation even further, right on the brink of the 1860 election.
And that 1860 election is the final trigger. Abraham Lincoln, running on the Republican platform, opposing the expansion of slavery into the territory, he wins.
Even though he wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states, his election was seen by the Deep South as an existential threat to their way of life, their economy, their entire social system built on slavery.
So South Carolina secedes first, in December 1860, followed by others.
Yes. The flashpoint then becomes Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Lincoln makes a very shrewd move. He informs the South Carolina authorities he's only sending a ship with food and supplies, no weapons or reinforcements.
Forcing the Confederacy to make the first.
Exactly. If they fire on an unarmed supply ship, they become the aggressors in the eyes of the nation and the world.
And they do.
On April 12, 1861, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard opens fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasts 34 hours. Miraculously, not a single Union soldier inside the fort is killed by the shelling. The Union commander surrenders.
But the attack galvanizes the North.
Completely. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. This call for troops triggers the secession of four more crucial Upper South states: Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. The Civil War has begun.
The source outlines the two distinct strategies, right? Union versus Confederacy.
Yeah. The Union, under General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, initially adopts the Anaconda Plan.
Named after the snake.
Right. The idea is to slowly strangle the South, use the U.S. Navy to blockade southern ports, cutting off trade, gain control of the Mississippi River to cut the Confederacy in two, separating Texas and Arkansas, capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, and defeat the main Confederate army in the east, led by Robert E. Lee.
And the Confederate strategy.
Much simpler, born of necessity. They knew they couldn't match the North's industrial might or manpower in a long war. Their hope was to win swift, decisive victories, particularly on northern soil, to break the North's political will to fight. They also desperately hoped for foreign intervention, especially from Britain and France, whose textile industries depended on southern cotton.
But that intervention never really...
Not meaning. Europe had largely abolished slavery and was reluctant to openly support a nation founded on preserving it. Plus, Union diplomacy and later Union victories made intervention politically impossible.
Okay, let's talk key leaders and turning. In the Eastern Theater, it's largely Lee versus a rotating cast of Union commanders.
Robert E. Lee's tactical brilliance and the fierce fighting quality of his Army of Northern Virginia kept the rebellion alive against enormous odds for years. He consistently outmaneuvered Union generals.
But in the Western Theater, the Union finds its man.
Ulysses S. Grant. He emerges as the North's most effective general. He wages relentless, aggressive campaign, captures key forts, and crucially, achieves a major strategic goal, capturing the entire Mississippi River with the successful siege of Vicksburg, which surrenders on July 4th, 1863.
And that happens almost simultaneously with the biggest battle of the war way up north.
Lee makes his second major invasion of the North, hoping for that decisive victory. He clashes with the Union Army of the Potomac under General George Meade from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. Culminates in the disastrous Pickett's Charge. Lee is soundly defeated and forced to retreat.
Vicksburg and Gettysburg happening at the same time. The source calls this the high tide of the Confederacy.
Absolutely, the turning point of the war. After July 1863, the Confederacy is largely on the defensive, lacking the resources to launch major offensives.
And Lincoln uses a victory just before Gettysburg Antietam in 1862 to change the entire purpose of the war.
Yes. After the bloody Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issues the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declares that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in rebellious territories would be thenceforward, and forever free.
Importantly, it didn't apply to slave states loyal to the Union or areas already under...
Correct. It was initially a war measure aimed at disrupting the Confederate war effort and economy, but it fundamentally transformed the conflict. It also allowed the Union Army to officially recruit black soldiers,
the United States colored troops,
who played a vital role in the Union victory. Emancipation shifts the war goal beyond simply preserving the Union to ending slavery entirely. It becomes a war for freedom.
Okay, final phase of the war. Grant is brought east, put in command of all Union Army. He faces off against...
And Grant, alongside his key subordinate William Tecumseh Sherman in the West, prosecute total war. Grant understands the North's manpower advantage. He relentlessly attacks Lee, forcing bloody battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor battles of attrition Lee cannot afford.
While Sherman marches through the South.
Sherman captures Atlanta in September 1864, a huge boost to Lincoln's re-election campaign, then begins his infamous march to the sea, cutting a path of destruction through Georgia, destroying infrastructure and resources, aiming to break the South's will to fight. He captures Savannah by Christmas 1864.
Lee's army is worn down, trapped.
Grant finally breaks Lee's lines at Petersburg, captures Richmond. Lee is forced to retreat west, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces, but Grant cuts him off. Lee surrenders his Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, 5. The war is effectively over.
At a staggering cost. Around 620,000 soldiers dead on both sides, plus countless civilians.
The deadliest conflict in American history.
Reconstruction begins almost immediately. The 13th Amendment is ratified in December 1865, officially abolishing slavery everywhere in the U.S. It had passed Congress in January.
A monumental step. But then, just days after Lee's surrender, tragedy strikes.
Lincoln's assassin, April 14th, 1865, killed by John Wilkes Booth at Fort.
A disaster for the nation, and particularly for the process of Reconstruction. It leaves the presidency in the hands of Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who was far more sympathetic to the former Confederacy and resistant to protecting the rights of newly freed African Americans.
Despite Johnson's opposition, Congress pushes through two more critical amendments.
The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., including former slaves, and guarantees equal protection of the law. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibits denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
So the legal framework for equality is being built, but the reality on the ground in the South is different.
Violent white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerge, using terror and intimidation to target black Americans, prevent them from voting, and restore white political control.
Grant, elected president in 1868, tried to fight back.
He did. He created the Department of Justice and used federal troops under the Enforcement Acts to aggressively prosecute and suppress the KKK, largely dismantling the first iteration of the Klan by the early 1870s.
But the federal commitment to Reconstruction eventually wanes.
Yes, this is a critical point the source emphasizes, the formal end of Reconstruction in 1877. It happens as part of a political deal, the Compromise of 1877, to settle the disputed presidential election of 1876.
How did that work?
Republican Rutherford B. Hayes is granted the presidency over Democrat Samuel Tilden. even though Tilden won the popular vote. In exchange, Hayes agrees to withdraw all remaining federal troops from the South.
And the withdrawal of those troops
Effectively abandons the federal government's promise to protect the civil and political rights of African Americans in the South. Southern states quickly moved to disenfranchise black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clause, and impose rigid segregation law.
the beginning of the Jim Crow era.
Systemic violence, disenfranchisement, and oppression that would last for nearly another century. The source portrays the end of Reconstruction as a profound failure, a betrayal of the promise of equality born from the Civil War.
Okay, so Reconstruction ends, the troops leave the South. The focus of the nation shifts again, largely west.
Yes, the end of the war really sparks a continued massive exodus west. And the defining symbol, the engine of this expansion, is the Transcontinental Railroad.
Built rapidly after the war, right, connecting the coasts.
Construction started during the war, actually 1863, and finished in 1869. An incredible engineering feat built by two companies racing towards each other, the Union Pacific Building west from Omaha, the Central Pacific Building east from Sacramento. It cut cross-country travel time from months down to under a week.
Built largely by immigrant labor, Chinese and Irish workers.
Primarily, yes. Facing incredibly harsh conditions, low pay, and especially for the Union Pacific crews crossing the plains, frequent attacks from Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes whose lands and buffalo herds were being disrupted. The line was finally joined at Promontory Summit, Utah in May 1869, famously marked with a ceremonial golden spike.
And wherever the railroad went, these instant towns sprang up. The Wild West.
Exact. Ramshackle settlements, hell-on-wheels towns became hotbeds of drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence. It created the archetype we know from movies. The famous, though often exaggerated, shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, involving Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. That becomes symbolic of this often lawless frontier.
Now, this whole period after Reconstruction up to about 1900 gets called the Gilded Age. Why gild?
The term comes from a Mark Twain novel. It suggests a thin layer of gold representing immense wealth, technological progress, abundance covering underlying problems, severe poverty, political corruption, economic inequality.
And a huge wave of immigration has happened.
Massive. The source says 7.3 million immigrants arrived between 1877 and 1900 alone. And the source of immigration starts shifting fewer from Northern and Western Europe, more from Southern and Eastern Europe after about 1880. Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews.
Which fueled backlash.
Intense nativism.
Right.
Anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-Chinese sentiment was rampant, fueled fears about jobs, cultural change, radicalism.
At the same time, the government is actively encouraging settlement of the West.
Through acts like the Homestead Act and the Railroad Land Grant Act, both passed in 1862 during the Civil War. These policies essentially gave away or sold vast tracts of Native American land at very low price to railroad corporations, white farmers, and immigrants actively advertising in Europe to attract settlers.
And the economy is transforming rapidly. Industrial output is skyrocketing.
Unbelievably. Wheat production up 256%, corn up 222%, railway track mileage up 567% between 1865 and 1900. But this new industrial wealth was incredibly concentrated.
The source mentions the top 10%.
Owning more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth by 1900. And mechanization was replacing skilled artisans with lower-paid, unskilled workers, often immigrants, performing repetitive tasks in factories under dangerous conditions.
Which naturally leads to labor unrest, conflict between workers and capital.
Vicious conflict. Poor working conditions, long hours, low pay, lack of job security sparked numerous large-scale strikes, often met with violence. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 paralyzed much of the nation's rail traffic for 52 days. It was brutally put down by state militias and federal troops, resulting in over 100.
Then the Haymarket Square riot in Chicago.
Started as a peaceful rally protesting police brutality against striking workers. Someone threw a bomb into the police ranks, killing several officers. Police fired back into the crowd. 8 labor organizers and anarchists were convicted, some executed, on flimsy evidence. It became a major setback for the labor movement, associating it with violence and radicalism in the public, though many saw the convicted men.
And the Pullman strike in 1894.
Another massive disruption. Workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company near Chicago went on strike after the company cut wages significantly, but refused to lower rents in the company-owned town where workers were required to live. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, launched a nationwide boycott of Pullman cars, severely disrupting rail traffic across the Midwest.
How did that end?
President Grover Cleveland, arguing the strike interfered with U.S. mail delivery, sent in federal troops over the objections of the Illinois governor. Violence erupted. Debs was arrested. The union was crippled by a federal court injunction. A major defeat for organized labor, showing the federal government consistently siding with capital.
Against this backdrop of conflict, you have the rise of these industrial titans, the robber barons.
Figures like John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in steel, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, J.P. Morgan in finance. They built colossal empires, often using ruthless tactics, driving competitors out of business, forming monopolies and trusts to control prices, exploiting workers, buying political influence, accumulated unimaginable wealth.
But they faced pushback. Not just from labor, but from journalists, the muckrakers.
Yes, a crucial check on corporate power. Investigative journalists began exposing the corruption and abuses. Ida Tarbell's scathing series on Rockefeller's Standard Oil practices contributed to the eventual breakup of the company by the Supreme Court.
And Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle.
Published in 1906, it exposed the horrifyingly unsanitary conditions in the Chicago meatpacking industry. Public outrage led directly to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act that same year.
Photography played a role, too.
Jacob Riis's powerful photojournalism book, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, depicted the squalor of New York City's tenement slum. It shocked the public conscience and helped spur housing reform movement. These muckrakers were instrumental in creating public demand for change.
The era was also marked by incredible technological marvels alongside these problems.
Absolutely. Thomas Edison invents the first practical, long-lasting incandescent light bulb in 1879, revolutionizing urban life in India.
And the Brooklyn Bridge opens in 1883.
An engineering triumph, the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time. Its construction, using new methods for spinning steel wire cables developed by John Roebling, was incredibly difficult and dangerous.
Roebling himself died early on, didn't he?
Yes, died from tetanus after an accident surveying the site. His son, Washington Roebling, took over as chief engineer, but was crippled by caisson sickness, the bend, from working in pressurized underwater chambers for the Tower Foundation.
But his wife, Emily Roebling, stepped in.
Famously, yes. She became his crucial liaison, relaying his instructions to the engineers, learning the technical details herself, essentially overseeing the project's completion from his bedside for years. She was the first person to ride across the finished bridge by carriage. A remarkable story of ingenuity and perseverance, but also highlights the human cost of these Gilded Age achievements.
But the Gilded Age wasn't all progress. It ended with another economic crisis.
The Panic of 1893, caused by overbuilding of railroads, shaky financing, international investment failure, led to a run on banks, hundreds of bank failures, thousands of business bankruptcies, unemployment soared, reaching maybe 20% nationally, one of the worst depressions in American history up to that point, setting the stage for calls for more fundamental political and economic reform.
Okay, the 1890s. Manifest destiny on the continent is basically complete. So the U.S. starts looking outward, a period of imperialism.
Yes. The focus shifts, particularly to the Pacific and the Caribbean. The first major move, the source highlights, is the annexation of Hawaii.
Driven by American business interests, sugar plantations.
Primarily. American planters had dominated Hawaii's economy for decades. Plus, strategic military interests, the U.S. had been leasing the naval base at Pearl Harbor since 1887.
And they overthrew the Queen.
In 1893, a group called the Committee of Safety, mostly white American businessmen and landowners, with the implicit support of U.S. Marines landed from a nearby warship, overthrew the reigning monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. They established a republic, hoping for immediate annexation by the U.S.
Did that happen right away?
Not quite. President Grover Cleveland actually condemned the coup as illegal and tried to restore the Queen, but the provisional government refused to step down. 5 years later, under President McKinley during the Spanish-American War, Hawaii was officially annexed as a U.S. territory in 1898.
Which brings us to that war, the Spanish-American War. What was the context?
A combination of factors: long-standing U.S. interest in Cuba, still a Spanish colony, growing American sympathy for the Cuban rebels fighting for independence, fueled by sensationalistic yellow journalism portraying Spanish atrocities, and a general desire to assert American power and kick the last vestiges of European colonialism out of the hemisphere.
And the trigger ain't the USS Maine.
The battleship USS Maine mysteriously explodes and sinks in Havana Harbor in February 1898, killing 268 American sailors. While the cause was likely an internal accident, the Yellow Press immediately blamed Spain. Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain became the inescapable rallying cry. War was declared in April.
And the war itself was short.
Very short and decisive. Less than 4 months. Key battles include Commodore George Dewey destroying the entire Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in the Philippines, famously pausing the battle for his officers to have a second breakfast.
Confidence.
And the land battles in Cuba, like the Battle of San Juan Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt and his volunteer cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders, gained fame.
And the results? Spain is defeated easily.
Completely. In the Treaty of Paris, 1898, Spain renounces all claims to Cuba, which becomes nominally independent but under heavy U.S. influence, cedes Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and transfers sovereignty over the Philippines to the U.S. in exchange for $20 million.
So the U.S. emerges as a major world power with overseas territory.
Absolutely, a turning point. The U.S. is now an imperial power.
This overseas expansion coincides with a period of intense domestic reform, right? The Progressive Era, roughly 1900 to 1970.
Yes. characterized by this widespread desire for change, for reform, an effort to address the serious problems created by rapid industrialization, urbanization, and immigration slums, poverty, dangerous working conditions, corporate monopolies, political corruption.
And Theodore Roosevelt, who becomes president in 1901 after McKinley's assassination, really embodies this era.
He does. TR embraced the idea of using the power of the federal government to regulate industry and mediate social conflict. He famously wielded the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed back in 1890 but rarely, to break up large corporate trusts he viewed as harmful to the public interest.
Like J.P. Morgan's railroad.
The Northern Securities Company, yeah, a major victim. He also intervened in the 1902 anthracite coal strike, not by sending troops to break the strike as previous presidents had done, but by using federal mediation to broker a compromise. His campaign platform was the Square Deal, promising fairness for labor, capital, and the public, focused on trust busting, conservation of natural resources, and consumer protection.
And broader progressive reforms are happening too, cleaning up government.
Big focus on that, fighting political machines, making government more responsive to the people. This era sees the adoption of key constitutional amendments, the 16th in 1913, allowing a federal income, and the 17th, also in 1913, providing for the direct election of U.S. senators by the people, rather than by state legislatures, which were often seen as corrupt.
Even bizarre tragedies sometimes spurred. The source mentions the Great Molasses Flood.
In Boston, 1919, a truly bizarre event. A massive storage tank holding millions of gallons of molasses burst, sending this huge, sticky wave, maybe 25 feet high, through the streets at estimated 35 miles per hour.
That sounds terrifying.
Killed 21 people, injured 150. The subsequent class action lawsuit against the Purity Distilling Company, finding them liable for the faulty tank construction, was a landmark case that helped establish principles of corporate responsibility and led to stricter building codes and industrial regulation.
Another major social movement during this era is prohibition,
gaining massive traction. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League saw alcohol as a root cause of social evil, poverty, crime, domestic violence. They were incredibly effective politically. By 1917, about two-thirds of the states had already enacted state-level prohibition. This momentum leads directly to the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919. Prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcoholic beverages nationwide, kicking off the Prohibition era proper in 1920.
Now, while all this reform is happening, the source is careful to point out that race relations are arguably at their worst point since slavery.
Yes, historians often call this period the nadir of American race relations. It's marked by severe racial violence. Was tragically common, the solidification of legalized segregation under Jim Crow laws across the South, and the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters through various means like the Grandfather Clause.
The Red Summer of 1919.
A wave of intense white mob violence against black communities in cities across the country. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of black men were murdered. It's during this period that the Great Migration begins, and earnest African Americans moving north in large numbers, seeking economic opportunity and escaping Southern oppression. But they still faced hostility, discrimination, and segregation in northern cities too, like in sundown town.
Amidst this, though, another major progressive victory, women's suffrage.
Yes, after decades of struggle, organizations like the National Woman's Party, led by figures like Alice Paul, used more militant tactics, protests, picketing the White House, combined with the undeniable contributions of women to the workforce during World War I, the political pressure became overwhelming. The 19th Amendment is finally ratified in 1920, prohibiting voting discrimination on the basis of sex, a monumental achievement.
And one last huge project completed in this era, symbolizing American power and technological prowess, the Panama Canal.
Completed in 1914, the U.S. took over the ambitious project from the French, who had failed. It involved cutting a 50-mile canal across the Isthmus of Panama, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
And an incredible undertaking.
Massive challenges. Required overcoming deadly tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria, thanks to pioneering work on mosquito control. Involved excavating mountains, building the largest dam in the world at the time, and devising an ingenious system of locks to lift ships over the Continental Divide.
The cost was immense.
$375 million, the most expensive construction project in U.S. history to date, and a tragic human. The source estimates at least 5,600 workers died during the U.S. construction phase alone, mostly from disease and accident. But its completion was a critical boost to global trade and travel, and a powerful symbol of American engineering might and global reach.
Okay, 1914. War erupts in Europe. World War I. President Woodrow Wilson declares neutrality.
Yes, the U.S. tries to stay out of it initially. Strong isolationist sentiment, but German actions make that increasingly difficult.
Like the sinking of the Lusitania.
May 1915. A German U-boat sinks the British passenger liner Lusitania. Over 1,100 people die, including 128 Americans. Outrages public opinion, but doesn't immediately bring the U.S. into the war.
What finally does?
The tipping point is early 1970. Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American ship. And then the Zimmermann telegram is intercepted.
What was that?
A secret message from Germany to Mexico, proposing a military alliance if the U.S. enters the war. Germany promised Mexico help in regaining lost territory, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. When this becomes public, combined with the submarine attacks, it turns public opinion decisively. Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917.
How did the U.S. mobilize for war? The home front.
Massive mobilization. The entire economy is geared towards the war effort. The government creates agencies to manage resources, production, labor. The Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, creates vast amounts of pro-war propaganda posters, speeches, films.
But civil liberties suffered.
Severely. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 essentially outlawed criticism of the war effort that drafted the government. Thousands were prosecuted, including socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, a major suppression of dissent.
Women played a big role, too.
Huge role. Moved into factory jobs, vacated by men who went off to fight, and served in non-combat roles overseas, notably as the bilingual Hello Girls, switchboard operators for the Army Signal Corps in France, crucial for military communication.
And the American troops, the AEF, how do they impact the war?
The American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing start arriving in large numbers in late 1917 and early 1918. By the spring of 1918, they're injecting about 10,000 fresh troops a day onto the Western Front. Their involvement in key offensives like the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in the fall of 1918, helps break the stalemate and leads to the German surrender in November.
The U.S. contribution was significant, but the casualties were lower than the other major powers.
Relatively lower, yes, because they entered late. About 53,402 battle deaths, plus more from disease, mainly the Spanish flu pandemic. Wilson then plays a leading role in the post-war peace negotiations.
The Treaty of Versailles. And his big idea, the League of Nations.
Wilson's vision for an international organization to prevent future war, he negotiates it into the Treaty of Versailles. But back home,
the Senate rejects.
Yes. Divided between isolationist irreconcilables who wanted no part of international commitment, and Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge who wanted changes Wilson wouldn't accept. The U.S. Senate never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles. It's the first time in U.S. history a peace treaty is rejected. The U.S. never joins the League of Nations, making a separate peace with Germany in 1921. A major blow to Wilson's vision, and a sign of America's continuing ambivalence about its global role.
After the war, the U.S. enters the Roaring '20s, a period of economic boom.
Big time. Fueled by post-war demand, technological innovation like the spread of electricity in automobiles, and the rise of consumer credit.
And a major demographic shift.
For the first time, the 1920 census shows more Americans, 51%, living in cities and towns than in rural villages or on farms. Urbanization transforms American life.
Culture changes rapidly, too.
Definitely. The average work week falls, wages rise for many, people have more leisure time and disposable income, they embrace public amusements, movies become huge, dance halls, spectator sports, and consumer goods radios, telephones, washing machines, and especially Henry Ford's affordable Model T automobile become widely available, changing lifestyles profoundly.
And this is the jazz age.
Absolutely. Jazz music, born from black musical traditions, moves north with the Great Migration. Artists like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington become stars. Chicago and New York's Harlem become major centers. You even see some integrated social spaces like the famous Black and Tan clubs, where whites and blacks mix socially to hear the music.
But the source makes clear this black cultural visibility also inspired backlash.
Massive racist backlash. This period sees the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, fueled by anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish sentiment, but primarily targeting African Americans.
And the KKK becomes huge in the 1920s.
Shockingly powerful. Membership reaches an estimated 5 million by 1925. They exert significant political control in states like Indiana, Texas, Oregon, Oklahoma. This climate of extreme racial hatred leads directly to horrific events like the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, where a white mob destroyed the prosperous black neighborhood of Greenwood.
And all this is happening during Prohibition.
Yes, the 18th Amendment goes into effect in January 1920. But enforcing a nationwide ban on alcohol proves almost impossible.
Speakeasies flourish.
Underground bars. The source estimates there were 30,000 speakeasies in New York City alone, twice the number of legal bars before Prohibition. Bootlegging becomes a massive criminal enterprise.
Organized crime thrives.
Figures like Al Capone in Chicago build empires on illegal liquor, gambling, prostitution, often protected by bribed police and politicians. Capone's estimated income in 1927 was $60 million. Prohibition was largely seen as a failure, fueling crime and disrespect for the law.
The Roaring '20s come to a screeching halt in 1929, the Great Crash.
Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, followed by Black Tuesday. The speculative stock market bubble, fueled by overvalued stocks and excessive consumer debt, bursts spectacularly, triggers the start of the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in modern history.
And the iconic symbol of the era, the Empire State Building.
Completed rapidly, just 1 year and 45 days, right in the midst of the Depression. But it sat mostly empty for years, nicknamed the Empty State Building, because businesses couldn't afford the office, a symbol of misplaced ambition, perhaps.
The Depression is deepened by environmental disaster.
Starting in the early 1930s, severe drought combined with unsustainable farming practices on the Great Plains turns fertile topsoil into dust. Massive dust storms, black blizzards sweep across the region from Texas to Nebraska, destroying farms, forcing mass migration of Okies and others, famously depicted in Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath.
Into this crisis steps Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected president in 19...
FDR promises a new deal for the American people. He uses unprecedented executive power and government spending to try and stabilize the economy, provide relief, and create jobs.
The source highlights the WPA,
the Works Progress Administration, one of the most famous New Deal agents. Between 1935 and 1943, it employed about 8.5 million people on public works projects, building schools, hospitals, roads, bridges, airports. Also funded arts projects, writers, musicians.
Major infrastructure comes out of this.
Hoover Dam, LaGuardia Airport, parts of Mount Rushmore were WPA or related New Deal projects. Critically, the New Deal also establishes the Social Security Administration, providing unemployment insurance and old age pensions, creating a lasting federal social safety net. The source argues the New Deal fundamentally changes the role of the federal government in American life.
While the U.S. is dealing with the Depression, the world situation is deteriorating. Aggression in Europe and Asia.
Rise of fascism, Nazism, Japanese militarism. The U.S. tries to maintain isolationism through the 1930s, but that ends abruptly on December 7, 1940.
Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii.
Devastating attack, sinks or damages numerous battleships, kills over 2,400 Americans. Crucially, though, it fails to destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers, which were out at sea, and the naval base's fuel storage facility. This allows the U.S. Navy to recover relatively quickly.
And the attack brings the U.S. into World War II.
Immediately. Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declare war on the U.S. a few days later. The U.S. joins the fight against the Axis powers.
Mobilization on the home front is even bigger than WWI.
Total mobilization. The entire country gears up for war. Rationing, war bond drives, massive industrial production, the arsenal of democracy. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, famously symbolized by Rosie the Riveter.
But there's a darker side to the home front mobilization, too. Xenophobia.
Yes. Fear and prejudice against Japanese Americans reach fever pitch after Pearl Harbor. In February 1942, FDR signs Executive Order 9066.
Ordering the internment.
Ordering the forced relocation and internment of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the vast majority of them American-born citizens, away from the West Coast military zones into remote camps for the duration of the war. A grave violation of civil liberties, later acknowledged and apologized for by the government.
Okay, the war itself, Europe first strategy.
Yes. Allied leaders decide to focus on defeating Nazi Germany first. The U.S. begins fighting in North Africa with Operation Torch in late 1942, then the invasion of Italy in 1943.
And the decisive invasion? D-Day.
June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the massive Allied amphibious assault on the beaches of Normandy in France, opens the long-awaited Second Front against Germany in Western Europe, marks the beginning of the end for Hitler's regime.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the U.S. is fighting Japan.
A brutal island-hopping campaign across the vast Pacific Ocean, starting with Guadalcanal in 1942, moving closer and closer to Japan through incredibly bloody battles on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, keeping Japanese forces under constant pressure.
As the war nears its end, FDR dies.
April 1945. Vice President Harry S. Truman becomes president. He inherits the final stages of the war and the top-secret Manhattan Project.
The development of the atomic bomb.
Truman faces the decision of whether to use this terrifying new weapon against Japan to force surrender and avoid a potentially catastrophic invasion of the Japanese mainland, which planners estimated could cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives.
And he decides.
Yes. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay drops the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, uranium, on the city of Hiroshima. The blast instantly vaporizes tens of thousands near the center, creates a devastating firestorm, produces a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT.
3 days later,
after Japan still doesn't surrender unconditionally, the second bomb, Fat Man, plutonium-based, is dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, a 21 kiloton.
The human cost is immense.
Estimates vary, but the total killed immediately or within months from radiation sickness range from 129,000 to 226,000 people, overwhelmingly civilian. Japan announces its surrender on August 15th. World War II is over.
And the U.S. emerges fundamentally changed.
No longer isolationist, now the dominant global superpower. But the unleashing of atomic weaponry brings humanity into a terrifying new age of technology and potential annihilation.
Which leads directly into the next global conflict, the Cold War.
Roughly 1946 to 1991, an ideological struggle, a geopolitical rivalry pitting the United States and its allies, promoting democracy and capitalism, against the Soviet Union and its allies, promoting communism, characterized by proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and the ever-present threat of nuclear war.
The U.S. policy is containment,
trying to prevent the spread of Soviet influence and communism around the world. This leads to the nuclear arms race.
When does the USSR get the bomb?
They test their first atomic bomb in 1949, shocking the West. The U.S. responds by developing the even more powerful hydrogen bomb tested in 1952. The Soviets follow soon after. Nuclear testing escalates dramatically. The source notes over 100 atmospheric bomb tests worldwide in 1958 alone. Fear of nuclear war becomes pervasive.
Domestically, this fear fuels the Red Scare.
Yes. Senator Joseph McCarthy leads investigations, often baseless, into alleged communist infiltration of the U.S. government, military, universities, Hollywood. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, holds high-profile hearings. Thousands are accused, careers ruined, hundreds blacklisted, especially in the entertainment industry. A period of intense political repression and paranoia.
And the Cold War turns hot in several places. Proxy wars.
The Korean War, 1950-53, where U.S.-led UN forces fight North Korean and Chinese Communist forces, ends in a stalemate, dividing Korea permanently. An estimated 5 million people die, half of them civilians, and later Vietnam.
Driven by the domino theory.
The fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian nations would follow. U.S. involvement begins with advisors after the French defeat in 1954, escalates dramatically in the mid-1960s into a massive, devastating 10-year conflict that deeply divides American society.
The closest the world came to actual nuclear war.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. A terrifying 13-day standoff after U.S. spy planes discover Soviet nuclear missile bases being built in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy imposes a naval blockade. Tensions are incredibly high. Resolved when Soviet Premier Khrushchev agrees to remove the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. A moment the world held its breath.
The Cold War rivalry also plays out, the space race.
A competition for technological and ideological superiority. The Soviets score early victories, launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, in 1957, and sending Yuri Gagarin, the first human into space, in 1961.
Which spurs the U.S.
President Kennedy famously pledges in 1961 to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This leads to the massive Apollo program.
Culminating in Apollo 11.
July 20, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first humans to walk on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. A huge symbolic victory for the U.S. in the Cold War.
And the legacy of the space race goes beyond just...
Oh, definitely. Led to countless technological spin-offs we use today. Communication satellites, weather forecasting, GPS, advancements in computing, material science, even medical technologies like CT scan imaging and things like wireless headsets.
Okay, so while the U.S. is literally reaching for the moon back on Earth, there's another monumental struggle happening. The civil rights.
Yes, an uphill battle against the deeply entrenched system of Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement in the South, which had been legally upheld by the Supreme Court's infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision back in 1896, separate but equal.
But the legal foundation starts to crack in the mid-20th century.
The first major blow comes with the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. Chief Justice Earl Warren writes that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This legally overturns Plessy in the context of public schools and provides the crucial legal basis for challenging all segregation.
And this ruling energizes the movement on the ground, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr.
Absolutely. The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked in 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man, is a key early example. Led by the young Dr. King, the boycott lasts over a year, 381 days. Black residents walk, carpool, endure harassment, crippling the city's bus system financially.
Until the Supreme Court rules.
Yes, in late 1956, the court rules that segregation on public buses is unconstitutional, a major victory for nonviolent direct action.
But progress is met with fierce. Little Rock, Arkansas.
The Little Rock Nine. 9 black students try to integrate Central High School following the Brown decision. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus defies the federal court order and uses the Arkansas National Guard to physically block the students from entering.
A direct challenge to federal authority. How did the president respond?
President Dwight D. Eisenhower, initially reluctant to intervene forcefully, realizes he has to act. He federalizes the Arkansas National Guard, taking it out of Faubus's control, and sends in troops from the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division to escort the students into the school and protect them. A pivotal moment demonstrating the federal government's willingness, when pushed, to enforce integration.
The movement continues with nonviolent tactics like sit-ins and freedom rides.
Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, starting in 1960. The Freedom Rides in 1961, organized by CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, where interracial groups rode buses through the Deep South to challenge segregated interstate travel facilities. They faced brutal violence, firebombings, arrests.
But it forced the issue.
Yes, the violence against the Freedom Riders, widely publicized, forced the Kennedy administration to intervene and issue regulations banning segregation in all interstate transport facilities. Nonviolent protest was proving incredibly powerful in exposing the brutality of segregation to the nation and the world.
The Birmingham campaign in 1963 seems like another.
Large-scale protests led by Dr. King against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most rigidly segregated cities. The notorious Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, unleashed high-pressure fire hoses and police-attacked dogs on protesters, including children.
And the images were broadcast everywhere.
Horrifying image. Shocked the conscience of the nation and the world. Generated immense pressure on President Kennedy and Congress to act decisively on civil rights legislation.
Which leads to the March on Washington later that year.
August 1963. A massive demonstration, 250,000 people, black and white, gather in Washington, advocating for civil and economic rights for African Americans. It's where Dr. King delivers his iconic, "I have a dream."
And this pressure finally leads to landmark lit.
Yes. Inspired largely by the moral force of the movement and Kennedy's advocacy before his assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson pushes through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and ending segregation in public places. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally eliminates literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers that had disenfranchised black voters in the South for decades. Monumental achievements that fundamentally reshaped American society and legal protection.
The 1960s and 70s also see the rise of postmodern thought. Skepticism towards universal. How does the source connect this to the social changes happening?
It suggests this philosophical shift coincides with the baby boomer generation coming of age. They're questioning authority, protesting the establishment, particularly the Vietnam War, but also discrimination based on race, gender, sexuality, a period of intense social upheaval and cultural change.
With tragic moments like Kent State in 1970.
Ohio National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students, protesting the Vietnam War expansion into Cambodia, killing 4 and wounding 9, a deeply shocking event that further fueled anti-war sentiment and distrust of government.
The 70s were politically turbulent too. Oil crisis, water.
Yes. OPEC oil embargoes caused gas prices to skyrocket, leading to economic stagnation, stagflation. And the Watergate scandal, stemming from a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, unravels President Richard Nixon's administration, forcing his resignation in 1974, deepens cynicism about government.
President Jimmy Carter follows Nick. What was his focus?
Carter prioritized human rights, tried to calm international conflicts, negotiated nuclear arms reduction treaties with the Soviet Union, brokered the Camp David Accords peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, signed the treaty giving eventual ownership of the Panama Canal back to Panama. But his presidency became defined by economic struggles at home and ultimately the Iran hostage crisis,
where 52 Americans were held hostage in Iran for 444 days.
Following the overthrow of the U.S.-backed Shah of Iran, Carter's inability to resolve the crisis contributed significantly to his defeat in the 1980 election.
Which brings in Ronald Reagan and the rise of the conservative New Right. A shift in focus.
Big shift. Focus moves towards individual achievement, free markets, reduced government intervention. The Reagan Revolution.
Reaganomics.
Advocated deregulation, significant tax cuts, especially for corporations and the wealthy, and reduced spending on social programs, supply-side economics. Led to a severe recession in 1982, the worst since the Great Depression, but the economy eventually recovered strongly in the mid-'80s, though inequality also increased significantly. The rich got richer.
Social issues were prominent too, the AIDS crisis.
And the Reagan administration was heavily criticized for largely dismissing it in the early years, framing it as primarily affecting gay men and intravenous drug use. Not until 1987, when nearly 47,000 Americans were already infected, did the government launch a major public awareness campaign.
And the war on drugs escalated.
Dramatically. Increased criminalization, mandatory minimum sentences, particularly targeting crack cocaine, which was more common in minority communities, while powdered cocaine, more common among white, received far lighter penalties, a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. This led directly to the mass incarceration of young black men, a devastating social consequence.
Reagan's presidency wasn't without scandals either. Iran-Contra.
A major scandal involving the secret, illegal sale of arms to Iran, an enemy state, in exchange for the release of American hostages, with the profits then illegally diverted to fund the anti-communist Contra rebels fighting the government in Nicaragua, tarnished the administration's final years.
Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, oversees the end of the Cold War, but also leads the U.S. into the first Gulf War.
Yes, in 1991, after Saddam Hussein's Iraq invades neighboring Kuwait, threatening oil supply, Bush assembles a large international coalition under UN authorization. Operation Desert Storm swiftly defeats the Iraqi army and liberates Kuwait, establishes a precedent for large-scale U.S. military intervention in the Middle East in the post-Cold War era.
Moving into the 1990s and the 21st century, we enter the digital age, the rise of the
and the dot-com bubble. Late 1990. Widespread adoption of the internet fuels massive investor speculation in new internet-based companies, many with no actual profit. The NASDAQ stock index skyrockets 582% between 1995 and 2000.
And then it burst.
Lack of real earnings causes the bubble to burst spectacularly starting in 2000, wiping out an estimated $5 trillion in investor value by 2002. Many companies disappear, but survivors like Microsoft, Amazon, eBay emerged strong.
And then another major financial crisis later.
The Great Recession, starting in late 2007, triggered primarily by losses in the subprime mortgage market and the collapse of major financial institutions like Lehman Brothers in 2008, caused a massive global financial contraction, the most significant economic downturn since the Great Depression, required major government bailouts and reforms under the Obama administration.
This period also sees increasing political polarization and division.
The election of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton highlighted and perhaps deepened these divisions. Increased suspicion of foreign interference in elections, particularly from Russia and China, and growing domestic distrust of government institutions, the media, and even the electoral process.
Which culminates, in a way, with the events of January 6, 2021.
The insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Supporters of President Trump, fueled by false claims of election fraud and organized in part by extremist groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, breached the Capitol building while Congress was certifying the election result, forced lawmakers to flee, resulting in deaths and injuries, and represented an unprecedented assault on American democracy.
And the current global role. The source touches on recent aid.
Mentioned the Biden administration overseeing the chaotic withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan in August 2021, followed swiftly by the Taliban takeover. And the current situation, funneling significant military and financial aid to Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, positioning the U.S. once again as leading a coalition against authoritarian expansion. #outro. So looking back over this immense sweep of history, nearly 250 years since the Declaration, the source material's final analysis really seems to circle back to this idea of resilience. That despite enduring these massive, often incredibly violent changes, politically, socially, economically, the U.S. somehow always emerges, maybe not unscathed, hacked, and often arguably stronger in the long run. That core resilience seems to be what drove its rise to this status this source calls a modern Roman Empire.
That resilience, that ability to adapt, to absorb new populations, new ideas, even after intense conflict. It does seem to be the country's defining attribute.
It seems to be.
And today, the U.S. obviously remains a world leader. You have this population of over 334 million, drawn from every corner of the globe, arguably the most diverse nation on Earth, all while preserving these magnificent national parks, historical sites that speak to the sheer scale of the continent it occupies.
True, but the core challenge identified throughout this history remains, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The country is still wrestling with the legacies of its founding compromises, the shadows of slavery, conquest, inequality, just as it faces this current cycle of intense political division and distrust.
Yeah.
So the country's ability to adapt again, to continue what the founders called the Great Experiment in unifying such disparate peoples and interests under one democratic framework, that remains the central question, the ongoing challenge.
So we'll leave you, our listeners, with this final provocative thought. And it stems directly from the material we just discussed, especially given the deep divisions that were present from the Washington literally having to break up fistfights between soldiers from different colonies in 1775. The constant compromises over slavery that ultimately failed to prevent is this kind of intense political and social friction, just an inevitable, maybe even a necessary characteristic of trying to govern such a vast, diverse, and constantly changing.
Is friction the price of scale and diversity?
Exactly. And if it is inevitable, what are the limits of that friction before the whole system, the whole experiment, actually something for you to mull over until our next deep dive?